Thank you very much for having me. Firstly, I'd like to thank Chris and Ian, and particularly Megan and Lynn from the Griffith Asia Institute for organising this event. I've never been to Brisbane before, and I have to say that the welcome I've had here tonight is unquestionably the warmest I've had in all the Australian cities I've been to, so thank you. And as Chris mentioned, I was invited to give this talk by Professor Trude, Russell Trude, who I never met. He was a great friend of my parents-in-law, Angus's parents, that is, and I can only say that from all I've heard, he was an exceptional scholar, an exceptional politician, an exceptional man, and I'm really honoured to give tonight's talk very much in his memory and very much with him in our thoughts. So thank you to Russell. So India's Disappearing Railways. This book was published posthumously, as the introduction described by, it's the work of my late fiancé, who was an Australian photojournalist called Angus McDonald. Angus died in Burma in 2013, and this was one of his biggest sort of projects that he undertook, not professionally. He was a photojournalist who was based for many, many years in India, but out of the love of India's narrow gauge railways, he travelled all over India whenever he could, when he was on assignment or just to seek them out, particularly the narrow gauge railways of India. And the book was first published in the UK in 2014. It was exhibited at the Royal Geographical Society, where I'm a fellow. It went on to be exhibited at the Customs House in Sydney and in Melbourne. And I'm delighted to say it's sold out, so about 5,000 copies of the initial print run all sold out. It was a book of the year chosen by the Times in the UK, and it's just been a wonderful journey for me. And if you told me 4 years ago that I'd be giving talks all over the world about the narrow gauge railways of India, I would have said you were utterly mad. I wouldn't say I was an expert, so don't ask me anything too technical, but I do know quite a lot about them. So I'll be glad to take your questions later. But I can't take credit for any of the beautiful images in the book. That is the work entirely of Angus, who you can see here trekking the Great Wall of China. And I'll tell you a little bit about him and his background, which I think tells you a lot about why he became a photographer, why he was such a good photographer, why he was so smitten by Asia, which really was the continent that captured his heart. He, like me, was a classic third culture kid. I don't know, I'm sure there are other third culture kids in the audience. Does anyone know what that means? So we were both brought up in countries and cultures other than that of our parents. So Angus's parents were diplomats, and he grew up abroad, born in Paris, schooled all over the place, lived for many years when he was a young child in India, and consequently, and it's a common affliction for children like us, we begin to feel as if we're more citizens of the world rather than of the country of our nationality. This is Angus on one of his first trips abroad when he was a teenager with the Akar Hill tribe in the Golden Triangle of Thailand near Chiang Mai. And he, of course, went on to become a renowned photojournalist. So travelled the Silk Road, was in Afghanistan when it was still occupied by the Russians, circled Mount Kailash, was in Lhasa during the Tibetan uprisings in 87, 88, 89. He was a photographer, an official photographer on an Everest expedition, a civil Indian expedition, which actually resulted in the death of 2 of the climbers, and went on to document socio-political and cultural issues for the next sort of 2 decades of his life. Trekked the Great Wall of China, as I said, covered the Maoist rebellions in Nepal, the tsunami, here we are in Tamil Nadu, the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. And he was also a published author. I don't know if any of you read Angus's book, The 5-Foot Road, which was his journey, his account of his journey following in the footsteps of Morrison of Peking, George Ernest Morrison. So Angus walked precisely 100 years after Morrison himself undertook the journey from Shanghai to Rangoon. And These are some of his images from the 5-foot road, which, if you haven't read it, I thoroughly recommend you do. Rather like, sadly, Russell, Angus was diagnosed with terminal cancer in 2012. And less than a year later, he died when we were traveling in Burma. He collapsed and died at the airport as we were leaving. A lot of our story and our history, by the way, is in my travel memoir, which is for sale outside. But I'm not here to talk about this. I will talk some more about the charity that we've established in Angus's memory at the end. But I'm here, of course, to talk about the hill trains. And this is where it all began. So does anyone know where this is? And have you been here? I'll give you a clue. MacLeod Ganj, exactly. So MacLeod Ganj, home to the Dalai Lama, of course, and one of the former hill stations of the British in India. And this is where Angus and I met. So he lived here, and I moved there to set up an NGO working with Tibetan refugees in the early 2000s. And this is important because it's a little-known fact that at the base of those foothills of the Himalayas, the Dauladar foothills, there is a beautiful narrow-gauge railway called the Kangra Valley Railway. It's a 2-foot gauge railway which runs from the Punjab right along to a place called Jogindanagar, which is sort of due south from MacLeod Ganj. It doesn't actually go up in the hills. But this was the narrow-gauge railway that really sparked Angus's love of these railways. And like a sort of Victorian plant hunter, if you like, he began to collect these railways and document them with his lens. This is another picture of the Kangra Valley Railway, and it's absolutely stunningly beautiful. If you haven't ever been, I thoroughly recommend that you go. And in fact, of all the 10 railways which are covered in the book, Angus believed this to be the most beautiful. Now, for anyone who hasn't traveled by rail in India, I've got a great clip here just to get us all in the mood. This is a scene of an Indian station.
An Indian railway station is more than a stopping place. It is, in fact, a way of life. Indian people don't go to railway stations, they inhabit them, sometimes literally so. The station is a social centre, a nexus of life, a bazaar, an island of activity in the midst of 800,000 villages, where you can come by almost anything you want, from an orange to a bangle. It may be a couple of days or 3 before your train is due, so what can be the hurry? In the meantime, on the station, one plays, waits, lives, waits some more while time slips by, washes, eats, sleeps, reflects on eternity. Above all, waits.
There we are, and Indian railway stations haven't changed much since then, as most of you know who've been there. So this is where it all began. The Indian railway system was almost entirely down to this one man. Any ideas who this is? He was British, Lord Dalhousie. So Lord Dalhousie was a Governor-General of India. He was, at the time he was appointed Governor-General, the youngest ever Governor-General of India, aged 36. And he was quite a controversial figure. He was the last Governor-General before the mutiny. He followed quite dramatic programs of infrastructure building, modernization, annexing of so-called lapsed states under the doctrine of lapse. He was a very controversial figure. He has his detractors and he has his fans, and I suppose, you know, that's for another talk. But the one thing he was absolutely, you know, committed to doing was to leave India with a railway network. And he had been as a member of Parliament in Britain, president of the Board of Trade. And one of the main things that he oversaw was railway mania in the UK. So this was when, after the advent of steam railways, the proliferation of railways that grew up in the UK was rampant. And he presided over that. So he knew precisely how the railways worked, the system, the infrastructure, and so on and so forth. And this, in 1853, he penned his famous Railway Minute, which was his document to the East India Company back in London to say, this is how much money I want, this is what I want to do. And that very year, built the first trial railway line, which was 26 miles from Bombay to Thane. And the year after that, built the next line, which was from Calcutta to Raniganj, where there was very rich in coal fields. This was the very first ever station, which was at Burdwan on that line, the Howrah to Raniganj line. And within about 5 years, every major Indian town had one of these. I mean, we're talking, my local railway station in the Lake District in England, where I live, looks exactly like this. So, typical Victorian railway station with retiring rooms and restaurants and, very, very solid. And this began the stamping of the dominion, if you like, of railway imperialism, which is the term that we now use to describe this era when essentially the hinterland of India was opened up for exploitation, people, resources, you name it. This was exactly why Dalhousie wanted to do this. I put this picture here because Angus took a picture about 100 years later, which is almost the identical structure that you see there. Here we have some British investor, no doubt, maybe a local civil servant being pushed along by some coolies. Here we have a local Indian government official being pushed along by some coolies. This is actually on the Kangra Valley Railway line. And of course it was about money. It was about resources, money, trade. Dalhousie, of course, was reaping all the results and all the benefits, if you can call them that, of the Industrial Revolution back in the UK. He was importing into India the steel and all the raw materials from the north, from Glasgow and Leeds and places like that, and exporting back to the colonies all of the vast resources that India had to offer. And you can just imagine what these huge monsters of iron and steel and these giant girders, what these look like on the landscape, and how India was utterly transformed by, in a relatively short space of time, this very, very fast development of this infrastructure. And here are just a few scenes from the book, which I'll talk about in depth, a few of the examples. But this is where Angus's book comes in, and this is where the narrow gauge railways come in. So Dalhousie wanted to build one gauge and one gauge alone because he was a great pragmatist. He was a utilitarian. He liked to see himself as a bit of an Orientalist, but really what he wanted was to be as efficient as he could be, and for that he saw that one gauge would be the answer. That's all right. But as soon as he left India in 1856, a whole number of narrow gauge railways soon proliferated, precisely because the Indian landscape is so varied. So these are railway lines that developed according to the landscape in which they were built. So we have here the Nilgiri in Tamil Nadu, the Barak Valley Express, which is in Assam, and it goes through the North Kachar Hills, not such a high elevation, but a different gauge again. So these two railways are both 3-foot gauge railways. And here we have the Matheran, which was a 2-foot gauge railway built just to take Bombayites up to the hill station of Matheran in the Western Ghats. And we have here the famous, again, the beautiful Kangra Valley Railway, which has 970-something bridges built on it. So, and that just travels 160 kilometers, extraordinary, and goes through, immensely flat salt marsh type landscapes right up to the foothills of the Himalayas. But interestingly, the very first narrow gauge railway was not a hill railway. It was in a place called Gujarat, which some of you may have been to. And the first narrow gauge railway in India was the Dubai Railway, the Dubai Railways to be precise, a biggish network built by the Gaikwad of Baroda. So Gaikwad means protector of cows, cows being very, very important for many reasons, and the head of the Maratha clan who ruled the princely state of Baroda. And he saw a business opportunity. It wasn't just the Brits who were building these railways. More often than not, it was the Indians themselves. And he built the railway in direct result of the American Civil War. He saw that the global cotton shortage would mean that the fertile cotton-growing industry of Gujarat would come into its own. And for the next several years, the Gaikwad of Baroda exported cotton to the rest of the world on a 2-foot gauge railway, which for the first 10 years of its existence was pulled by bullock carts because the rails were not strong enough to hold the locomotive engine. So bullock carts from the Gaikwad of Baroda's railway line basically plugged the gap of the cotton shortage as a result of the American Civil War. And then, of course, I suppose if you think of narrow gauge railways, you do think of the hill railways. I'm sure many of you have traveled on this one here. Does anyone know where this is? It's hilly, it's green, it's Darjeeling. And of course, it's the world-famous hill railway. If anyone talks about the hill railways of India, they say the Darjeeling Himalayan. It is iconic. To use a word I'm not keen on, but it is very much iconic. This was the first hill railway, and it was also technically ingenious in many, many ways. Just before I show you more of the Darjeeling Himalayan, Darjeeling had been a cantonment and a sanatorium for some years at this point, so this was built in the 1880s. So a good 20 years after the Dubai Railways, so there was a bit of a hiatus where nothing much happened in the narrow gauges. And if you had wanted to go to Darjeeling before the railway was built, you had to travel, first you had to get to the Ganges, then you would have taken a steamboat across the Ganges, then you would have taken a bullock cart, it would have rolled you up the hill, and gone from an elevation of about 100 meters to about 2,200 meters. And it would have taken you days, and it would have been very painful, frankly. This is called Hill Cart Road, because this is where the cart used to carry the British up to the cool hills of Darjeeling. Then the Darjeeling Himalayan Railway was built, and it was absolutely, at its time, it was like, the Steve Jobs of the day. Franklin Prestage described it as being, the most life-changing invention ever. It utilized things like these loops that you see here, which looped around particularly difficult parts of the landscape. And it also utilized these Z-shaped reversing stations where the train would go one way up and another way up until it reached a point where it could continue around the mountain. And the Darjeeling Himalayan, if you haven't been, and if I do encourage you to go, if you're planning to go to India soon, I recommend that you go and see it. It was also full of the wonderful idiosyncrasies that India is famous for, and why people like me who love India love it so very much. This is a lady who haunted, quite literally, the Himalayan Darjeeling Railway. She was called the Witch of Goom by the lovely British. She was actually a woman of Tibetan origin who was of indeterminate age. I mean, she could be my age, she could be 100, who knows. But she used to walk up and down the train as it went up begging. And when she died, it was discovered that she had actually amassed a fortune. She was probably a modern-day millionaire. And they built an orphanage in her name in Darjeeling, named after the Witch of Goom. Goom being the station on the line, which is the highest station in India. I don't think it's the highest station in the world, but it's the highest station in India, 2,225 meters high. And of course, during the Second World War, these railways played a hugely important role. Here we have the this is cantonment above Darjeeling, so it was a strategic point for ferrying not only munitions and so forth, but also for wounded soldiers who would go and rest and recuperate in Darjeeling. I think I have a clip of the Darjeeling Railway. Mother Teresa, of course, had her famous visitation on the Darjeeling Himalayan, where she was told to go and serve the poor of Calcutta. Don't know if anyone knew that, but that's another little fact about it. And from the same program that the station clip comes from, this is a really wonderful clip of traveling on the Himalayan Darjeeling Railway.
This is quite particular. For Mike Sato, a special little train, as befits a specialist. An observation coach for the #1 connoisseur of all Indian trains, and the Himalayan toy train in particular.
How many of the B-class engines are still working?
All 25 of them are
25, they're all working.
And on line we have 16 of them.
Every so often, of course, some disaster strikes this railway. The monsoon washes away large sections of the track. And every time this happens, those of us who love it feel this must be the final death knell of the railway, which, after all, is losing money to the extent of 75% of its operating costs. But there are strong arguments in keeping it alive. First of all, if it were closed, 2,000, 2,500 people would be without a job in an area which certainly can't provide alternative employment. But even on the emotional side, or the more emotional side, as seen by the railway enthusiast, this is surely one of the most famous, one of the best known of these hill railways. I don't think anybody could fail to be moved by the excitement of the toy railway, as it's called, up to Darjeeling. It's always known in the most friendly fashion as the toy railway. And for 54 miles, this exciting little railway plods uphill over the top at Goom, right on top of the world, because when you come through Goom and into the famous double loop at Batasia, you get your first glimpse of the snow and Kanchenjunga looming behind Darjeeling, which at that point lies about 600 feet below you.
There we are. So there then followed, about the turn of the century, a real boom in the building of these narrow gauge railways. They then began to proliferate all across India. So 1903, that was a really key year. So the Barak Valley Express in Assam was built. That basically connected the port of Chittagong with the very fertile and Assam, the fertile regions of Assam, where tea, silk, rice, all those sorts of products were being grown. The Shakuntala Express, which really was built more as a utilitarian train to connect the communities around these parts of Madhya Pradesh. The famous Kalka-Shimla, which is another UNESCO World Heritage listed railway line, like the Darjeeling Himalayan. This one is particularly famous for its tunnels. There's about a tunnel per kilometre on this line, which means there's about 110 tunnels. So it's going through a tunnel every kilometre, and which is a great shame because you miss a lot of the scenery. But it's very beautiful. And again, their provenance was always weird and wonderful. So here we have a rich Parsi industrialist called Peerboy, Adam G. Peerboy. And he decided to build the Matheran Railway, the one I showed you before, which is a very short railway. It's only about 20 kilometres long. It connects the main Bombay line up to the hill station of Matheran. It's the line which is on the cover of the book. And in my view, it's actually probably, for me, the most beautiful. And here we have One Kiss Tunnel, which is famous, you can guess why, on the line. And then we have a really interesting line, which was built by this man, another Maharaja, the Maharaja of Gwalior in Madhya Pradesh. And when he was a little Maharaja, he had a British tutor, as one did then, called Mr. Johnston. And he said to Mr. Johnston that he really wanted a toy train. And the little Maharaja really did want a toy train, just something he could play with. And his tutor went off on home leave to England one year. And when he sailed back, he brought with him about 6 miles of track, 2-meter gauge track, 6 carriages, and a steam locomotive. So the Maharaja of Gwalior got more than he bargained, but from that 6 miles of track, there developed a network of 200, about 150 miles, 200 kilometers, the Gwalior Light Railway. And again, this was a utilitarian line, didn't ferry the Brits, you know, from hot places to cool places. It was an economic tool, a device. It also helped in times of famine. So many of these Maharajas and local leaders were also very deeply, you know, committed philanthropists. So there is a sort of whistle-stop tour of how they came about. But the thing that Angus's book is really about is not about the machinery or the bogies and the reverse loops and the Z reversing stations that I told you about, but they are about people. And if you choose to buy the book, and if you you'll need to spend a long time looking at it, because there's so much to see. And what you're looking at is a dying way of life. So these railways were trade routes, of course. They were literally people's homes, as you saw from the previous clip. Indian railways are, Paul Theroux said that they're not a mode of transport, they are a place. So, you know, they are places where people live and work and trade and communicate with one another. They're sanctuaries. They're in a country that's teeming with people and teeming with, you know, sounds and noises, and your senses are under continuous assault. They're remarkably quiet places to be, if you can afford to be in not coach class. But they're also places of joy and places that are beloved, you know, by Indians young and old, and beloved by we tourists who are lucky enough to travel on them and to have traveled on them. And they're places of wonder and, you know, people's bedrooms and people's daily commute. That's actually on the Gwalior Light Railway, which I just told you about, built by the young Maharaja. So if Angus's book is about anything, it's about preserving a way of life that is increasingly being crowded out by the modern world. And we see it not just in India, we see it not only in the East and in Asia. You know, I see it in England and in the UK where I am, where railways which have traditionally transported people are no more. And once they've ended, they're very expensive and very difficult to revive. And since Angus began taking these images in around 2003, up to, he spent about 7 years in total, so up to about 2010, some of the railways which are documented in his book have stopped running. Hence, it is really the only document of its kind that has preserved these images, this way of life, for all to see. And if you think about where India's going, and you think back to Lord Dalhousie, who I talked about earlier, this is, of course, Narendra Modi. Now, Narendra Modi, in a curious way, is reviving those British imperial dreams of efficiency. And he's a very keen believer in a project called Project Unigauge. So he wants to go back to Lord Dalhousie's dream of having one gauge. So he thinks all these narrow gauge railways, which, you know, they are propping up people's livelihoods, they're propping up communities, they're keeping Indians trading and traveling. But he wants none of it. So he sees the future as the Indian rail network as it is, the main Indian rail network, as connecting all of these communities. And of course, more and more Indians are now traveling by car, by bus, and he sees no need for them whatsoever. So the very, very sad thing is that these are a dying breed, as Angus unfortunately predicted. And I'll just read you a quote from Mark Tully. So Sir Mark Tully wrote the foreword to the book. And while Angus describes these as living treasures, Mark Tully does argue that they may well have a utilitarian function, and he questions, what is the merit in keeping them? And I'd love to hear your views on that. Is there any merit in keeping these railways going? Is there any merit in keeping them alive? They are a metaphor for so many other things that the modern world seems to want to leave behind. But Angus, who said that the human landscape was being crowded out by an industrial future, goes on to say that the case for keeping them, this is Mark Tully, is not simply utilitarian. They are living treasures. Just as agro-pastoralism has shaped the fell sides, so have these railways, to a large extent, shaped the Indian landscape. And you could argue, and of course the Darjeeling Himalayan and the Kalka Shimla, they have been, to an extent, preserved, being given UNESCO World Heritage status. So has the Nilgiri Mountain Railway as well. Is that the right thing to do? Is it something that we should be, supporting by being tourists and traveling on them? Or are we part of the problem? So I will leave you with a couple of images before I go on to talk a little bit about my work in Myanmar. The Barak Valley Express. The symbol of the Barak Valley Express is the Rhinoceros unicornus, the now extinct single-horned rhinoceros, which is found in Assam. And I can't help but think that that's a very telling and a very potent symbol for the railways themselves. And here are just some images from the book. Ending on Angus's favorite one, the Kangra Valley. So thank you very much, and I'm very happy to take your questions after I've spoken a little bit about the charity in Burma. Thank you. So as I said, when Angus died in Burma, it was extremely sudden. It was very unexpected, even though he had been ill for 11 months. And the kindness of the Burmese people who looked after me in particular, because I was there alone and I'd never been to Burma before, was unbelievable. And through friends and family, we began to collect funds to repay, to some extent, the kindness of the Burmese people who helped to cremate Angus in a traditional Buddhist ceremony. He wasn't actually a Buddhist, but we had to bury him in the country. And I was absolutely overwhelmed by the generosity of the Burmese people who have so little. Since then, I've traveled to Burma pretty much every year, 2 or 3 times a year, firstly to find projects to fund. This is me on the right with some tribespeople in Kayin State, which is one of the more remote states in Burma, where we are funding a small clinic. But we mostly work in Yangon. So this is a part of Yangon called Lang Taya. It's the most sort of depressed area of Yangon. It's a slum area. It's built largely on the banks of the Irrawaddy, where industrialization and development of Yangon has encroached on the farmland. And these are traditional farming families who are now working in factories in Yangon. And we run a HIV counseling and outreach center in Lang Taya, so that's me with some of the staff. One of the beneficiaries, who's a traditional Nat dancer, he has got HIV and TB. And we also run vocational training for the HIV and TB patients that we support. We run financial literacy training for some of the women who are our patients and who are part of our team there. And we do public health programs about how to, prevent TB from spreading and just to educate generally about these diseases. This is all in the slum area of Lang Taya. This is a family, all of whom have TB, but they are all now, I'm glad to say, well, and they completed their course of treatment. And we now give microcredit, so small microcredit loans, to the patients who've completed the TB program. And we're running literacy, financial literacy courses alongside that as well. And we run a maternal and child health program for the mothers who have got HIV and TB. So educating them about nutrition and various things and keeping their babies healthy. And that's one of the children that we support who has HIV. A year ago, we began to sponsor 40 children through school. Their schoolmates don't know that they're ill, but up until the point at which we began to sponsor them, they'd been working at home, trying to supplement their household income. The little boy on the left, his mother contracted HIV from her husband, who was a migrant worker. Very common among poor Burmese communities where the husband will go to work in Thailand or Malaysia or Cambodia, places like that, will contract the infection and bring it back. This boy contracted HIV in the womb, but he's now going to school. He's actually 12 years old, but the last time I saw him, he came up to my waist, but he's just lovely. And we're carrying all this out in Angus's memory, yes, but this is very much about his love for the country he traveled to in Morrison's footsteps back in '93, and for the future of the country. I mean, Myanmar, I'm very happy to chat about Myanmar afterwards, but Myanmar is going through an absolutely phenomenal change at the moment, politically, socially, economically, and there is, of course, a great danger that people will get left behind. So we're doing a very small bit to help, and there are some donors here in the audience tonight. I can't thank you enough for your support, and if anyone wanted to know more about the charity, please just let me know. Finally, my memoir, The End of All Our Exploring, is being released in Australia on the 7th of March, so I've just come back from the Melbourne Writers' Festival. It's not the annual Melbourne Festival, but they were doing a Jaipur Lit Fest collaboration this weekend, and we chose that to be the first outing for the book. But there are a few copies outside if you did want to buy it. It's a travel memoir. It is about my time in India, working and living in the Tibetan refugee community, where I met Angus, and about our time together, and about our time in Burma. And I'd be very happy to sign it if you wanted to have it signed. And all that remains is for me to say thank you again, and I'm very, very happy to take questions about anything I've talked about this evening. Thank you.
Well, as Catherine's kindly indicated, we've got a little bit of time for questions. If you could just pause while the microphone reaches you, that would be ideal. But who would like to ask the first question?
Someone up there?
I do have light shining in my face, but there is a question on the stairs.
You did say the railways were closing, but who is doing this? Is it the governments, or is it because there's not enough people using them, or what is why is that?
Well, it's a combination of both. So the question is, why are the railways, these narrow gauge railways, why are they becoming extinct, as it were? Well, it's partly Project Unigauge, which is the government-led scheme to close down anything which isn't 5 foot or thereabouts. I think the standard gauge is 5'2" or 3". Someone may correct me. Is that right, Ian? Okay.
I'm just trying to nod stage.
Okay. You and me both. The other reason, of course, is India. I mean, there is a middle class developing fast in India, and has been for many years, who would traditionally have used those railways. There is a move to use cars and mopeds, and there is, of course, India's heavily tarmacked. I mean, there are metalled roads everywhere. By the way, Dalhousie also introduced the metalling of roads. So it's a combination of the two. It's not as if they're even expensive to run or to travel on. You can travel about 100 kilometers for 10 rupees. So, you know, that's what, 50 cents? Less, yeah. So it's a combination, yeah.
I just wanted to add to that. That even occurs with political to relative poverty in Australia. But when you've got a country like India that has absolute poverty, and you have leaders that are trying to keep up with the Western world, they're not seeing all the socio-economics, the narratives, the whole things. And I think Western world, we could take a good stance with that, because we don't see in our own country, in Australia, Britain, America, and America has, QUT, we study this, has the highest inequalities for Western world. So we need more exposure in human behaviour, because there's relative poverty but absolute poverty at the bottom line, and that is a threshold for survival. And yeah, it's important.
Definitely, and you're absolutely right. And you know, there are certain things that you can do in India that don't require a lot of money, and they are key, they're crucial to people's livelihoods. And one of them is getting around and getting your, whatever it is that you're selling, whatever it is service that you're selling, whatever your job is, it's being able to do that. And I think governments everywhere suffer from a lack of devolution. So, and in fact, in India in particular, I was awarded a Winston Churchill Memorial Trust Fellowship to look at the devolution of the Panchayat Raj in India. And in fact, it is a model for how money should be spent locally and how local initiatives should be funded for the good of the community. And of course, transport is key. So it's key in Britain, it's key in wherever you go. I imagine it, well, I know it's key in Australia as well. So yes, I think you make a very important point. Thank you.
How much of a tourist attraction are these narrow gauge railways? As opposed to being functional for locals?
Yeah, well, of the 10 in the book, 3 are UNESCO World Heritage listed. Now, they're very much on the tourist, sort of on the beaten track. So it's very common for big tour groups to include a railway itinerary, one of which would be the Kalka-Shimla or the Darjeeling or the Nilgiri. But the other 7 in the book, you would be hard-pressed to see another Westerner if you travelled on them. And if you know, and I thoroughly recommend you try and sort of seek them out. If you're intrepid and you like travelling by train, then do, you know, look at this book and you will find that there are some hidden gems that you can go and see. Yeah.
Got a question off the back there.
We've always known that in Britain and in many parts of the world there's a great enthusiasm for trains. Is there now becoming a voice and a recognition of the uniqueness of these single gauge trains, and is that starting to propel greater awareness and a voice for these people?
Yes, there's a lot of heritage. There are a lot of heritage organisations in India, so run by Indians who recognise the value of these trains. Obviously, UNESCO sees them as World Heritage Sites. Of course, the flip side of that is that the people in the book who you see, and the people who do see these not as something pretty that they get to travel on every day to get to work, you know, it is a means to an end. So we have the luxury of seeing train travel as an end in itself. You know, how lovely to sit on a train and see all the beautiful landscapes. But for everyone in this book, for the everyday people and the everyday tribes people that Angus photographed, it's not an end in itself, it's a means to an end. And I think we have to be careful not to preserve things in aspic. You know, that's the only thing I would caution, which is why I mentioned that some people don't think that designating these things as World Heritage Sites is a good thing. They see it actually as a bad thing, because it means that you don't get the local communities travelling on them, you get the tourists you know, taking up all the seats and spending considerably more on a ticket. So, yeah.
We've probably got time just for one last question, if there's one burning there in the audience. No? Oh, there you are, sir.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I'm fascinated with Angus's process for documenting these railways. How much time would you and he spend accumulating these images? Were they just off single trips, or was it a repeated visit?
Well, over the course of those 7 years or so, and by the way, I didn't travel with him all the time, but he would sometimes go specifically to take images, and so he would spend maybe a week literally going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And for each of the lines, there's an archive of, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 shots. Yeah, so that's a lot of photographs. And he would go at different times, so during rush hour and when it was very quiet. And of course, the stations are, as you saw from the clip, it's not just the trains themselves and the landscape that he saw. He would often get off at a very obscure point and climb up some, rugged cliff just to get a shot, which, probably no one's ever photographed before, just, different perspective of the line. So all those different facets of Indian rail travel were covered, and sometimes he would spend longer on some lines than others, but generally, he'd try and really immerse himself in it. And as I say, there's a huge archive of images which are not in the book. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, look, it's left to me as the acting director of the Griffith Asia Institute to move a vote of thanks. Thanks to you, Catherine, but also to our wonderful partners here at Queensland Art Gallery, Gallery of Modern Art. Catherine, thank you for sharing these images, and also thank you for telling us about the wonderful work of the Trust as well. This evening's talk was a particular pleasure for me as an India specialist, but it brought to mind one oddity, I suppose, in my own story, which is that I have been travelling to India fairly regularly over the last 10 years or so as part of my work. But I must admit that in that decade, I've never been on a train. I have flown on India's increasingly multiplying low-cost airlines, as well as some of the more expensive ones. I have been driven on some of the good new roads and some of the awful bad old roads as well. But I've never been on a railway, and I'm kind of ashamed to say that. I've been on the metro systems, though, which are proliferating through India. The world of the Indian Railway, as you say, is being very evocatively described and shown here. And it is a world that is being lost as India is changing in so many ways and at such incredible speed as well. So thank you so much for bringing these images and these stories, and of course the books here as well. If you are interested in the book, or if you're interested in the memoir, then both Lynn and Christine have got cards from the bookshop, and if you collect one of those cards, you can phone, and the bookshop can provide you with one of those books for a reasonable fee. Huh. But look, thank you so much, Catherine.
Pleasure.
It's been a very great pleasure having you here. And welcome
here.
to Brisbane.
Thank
please
you.
come back.
I love Brizzy.
You're in Australia.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks.